You've probably seen Professor Lorna Unwin moving amongst us throughout the day and sitting in various workshops and looking at posters. And very delighted that Lorna was able to join us today. She's long been a great supporter of the FE sector, having come from the FE sector herself before she moved into higher education and finished her full-time working career at the Institute of Ed. So, Lorna, you're going to comment on what you've seen today and comment generally on the sector and where we're up to. So, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Can you hear me? Yes, all the way at the back? Yeah, good. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be invited back to this conference. As Sheila said, I've had some involvement, had the pleasure of going up to Sunderland. Well, in fact, it wasn't Sunderland. I think, where's Maggie? I think, where it was by the seaside. Seaburn, that's right. At the start of one of the research practitioner cohorts, if you like, and had great pleasure talking to them and working with them for a day. I'll try and say some things that I hope might be helpful about what I've seen, what I've got from today, and also perhaps link it to some of the broader ideas, some of which Norman Crowther touched on this morning, and I know some of you have been touching on in your projects. I wanted just very quickly to start by saying I think we should stand up and salute Sheila and the two teams, the Sunset and the MSET teams, led by Maggie and Ian, because this is a major initiative that should be kept going. Not just kept going, but should be properly invested in. And if our politicians and our policymakers had any sense at all, that's what they would do. Because if they don't invest in the kinds of research that you've all been doing, and think about research and the kind of R&D that the FE sector needs, that they would certainly recognise in industry as being vital to industry. We need it in education generally, and we certainly need it in the FE sector. So hats off to the people who've kept this going. But before I start, can you read that? I was told to say this. You can now take your posters home and display them in your organisation for all to see. And I just added, or you could sell them on eBay. I'm sure they'd, fetch lots of money. Okay, so that's the housekeeping bit. You can take them home. They're yours. Yours to keep. Okay. Go backwards. Right. Can you not see that because of this light? Yes. Anyway, it's a man standing at a water cooler trying to get a drink, and the caption says, "Do not linger, hazardous to your job." The point of that is that Norman Crowther talked about the conditions of the FE workplace, whether that's colleges or adult community spaces, prisons, wherever everybody works, as being quite contested spaces, because of course they're workplaces, and all workplaces are contested spaces. So I think the kinds of challenges that you face in being a professional and finding the time and the energy to not just reflect on your practice, but critically research your practice, that's always been problematic in further education, but particularly problematic now. And of course the best workplaces what Alison, Flora and I have called expansive workplaces, they not only invest in that kind of critical research and inquiry, they actually create the space for it. The mental space, the virtual space, and the physical space. And the physical space is really, really important. And one of the projects that I was found particularly interesting was the Grey Spaces project. Where's the person who did that?
She's had to go.
She's had to go. Oh, what a shame. Right, well, it was talking about teachers asking students about what she called the grey spaces. So what are the times in the day when you feel your learning dips? And what she and her colleagues did, that part of the project, was to create a more social atmosphere. So having students organise tea parties where they could talk to each other and so on. Very interesting. And of course, again, that's what the best workplaces do. So if you go to, real cutting edge companies in the software engineering industry, for example, you go into their buildings and what you notice is the space for professionals to meet and talk to each other and they used the phrase in that project this morning, break bread together. Because by eating and having a cup of coffee together or whatever, it really enhances professional learning. So that's something to think about in the days when certainly some colleges, I was talking to some school teachers recently, staff rooms are disappearing. If you squeeze out the space for reflection and discussion, how are you going to provide those opportunities? Okay, so lingering should not be hazardous to your job. It should be part of your job. So thinking about the research, and again, it was interesting looking at the posters, and I was able to listen to some of the sessions, what I think is particularly interesting about doing research is how you step into somebody else's shoes or look through the eyes of somebody else. And there were quite a few references in some of the discussions about how you actually think about trying to develop a new perspective. So whether that's because you're a teacher researching your learners or a manager doing research on your staff, or you're moving from one site of learning to look at learning taking place in another site, so in a vocational area, moving from a traditional classroom out into an industrial or a commercial workplace. How do you make that adjustment? And there's a lovely quote I remembered from To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee's great novel. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you can climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. And I think as a researcher myself, that's one of the biggest challenges, is trying to shed your own preconceptions, your own prejudices, your own agenda. And there's plenty of people in education with an agenda, whether that's to improve people's lives or whatever it is. It's trying to shed your own skin and climb inside the skin of somebody else. And so what I wanted to raise, and I'm going to be deliberately a bit provocative, and then I can run away when this is finished, is that education for a long time has been suffused with the concept of the reflective practitioner. And politicians love that because it's nice and soft and benign. It's obviously very important for professionals to reflect on their practice, but I think what this initiative does is it moves beyond that to what I've called critical inquiry, and I think that's really important. So don't let anybody tell you, oh, you've just been engaging in some reflective practice. You've been engaging in research, because again, looking at those posters and listening to people speak, the edge here is the criticality. So you're not just doing a kind of navel-gazing activity, you're actually trying to think about what the critical questions are, design a reasonably robust study to investigate them, and link that to what the existing research evidence tells us. That's very different to reflective practice. What's interesting, though, I think, from having a look at what everybody's been doing, is I would urge you to go further in the criticality. So some of the questions that I think the sector would really benefit from asking more about are what are the continuing structural barriers to learning, not just to students' learning, but to your learning as professionals. Social class, gender, race, power relations. Where do those big themes fit in the kind of research that you've been doing, and fit in terms of thinking about the way your own professional development is organised? I think that it's important to say those structural barriers are age-old. They've always been with us, and you know, many of us wake up each morning knowing you have to fight, do the fight all over again. But I think today, in today's climate, it's even more important because we're facing a really precarious future. Institutions are facing precarious futures. Individuals certainly are. We have a budget tomorrow. Goodness knows what the world will look like on Thursday. So I think if you, as researchers, can hang on to those big themes as well as looking at the more micro issues to do with teaching and learning and connect them, that's important. And then it's also very important to not let the policymakers steer us down a research path that's a dictated research path. Not to let them determine what we as professionals want to research is important. Okay, it's very clear from looking at the posters and again the sessions I've been in that the catalysts for research are many and varied, ranging from individual curiosity, which is incredibly important as a researcher, team concerns, organisational concerns. It's quite interesting, some of the issues go back a long way, some are more contemporary. Issues to do with the use of technology and so on have obviously quite a contemporary feel to them. Some people have engaged with policy issues. I think a way forward or a further step for this programme, this initiative, is to maybe think comparatively. So one of the ways in which I think some of those projects I've seen could really be pushed to the next step is to join up and create, as Norman called, a community of research practice. So can you in your institution, organisation, link up with somebody else who's here and say, how about we try what we did together so that we can get a bigger sample, we can try it out in different ways. And then, of course, there's also room for international comparison. And as educational institutions, you've got access to all sorts of European funding, including exchanges through Erasmus and so on. And this country is one of the worst in Europe for tapping into that funding and those opportunities. For teacher, post-school teachers and trainers in other European countries engage a lot in visiting different countries, joining with other professionals to create these kinds of transnational communities of practice. So I think there's quite a lot that could be done there. I mentioned that in some of the sessions and in some of the posters there are references to existing research, to theories, and so on. And I think this is really important. I've written before, and I'm very interested in what I've called here the productive system of further education. And Norman talked quite a bit about the existential crisis in FE. But the further education sector is like the health sector in this country. It sits within a very top-down productive system. In other words, there's a lot of agencies and bodies before you actually get to your classroom or your workshop, all pressing down and things shooting in from the side to tell you what to do. So one of the ways to really think about creating the space for research is think about what are the barriers to that, where are they coming from? What barriers are there coming from within your organisation and which ones are coming from without? And what can we do to change that? Because what your research shows, of course, is that you start off looking at what you think is not necessarily an isolated issue, but you might sort of think it's ring-fenced. And of course, through doing the research, what you find is it's interrelated to other issues. So the more we can see how what initially starts as a micro-study of something that's very important to you as an individual professional or to your organisation actually exposes wider problems, wider challenges. And so what I've called here the politics of access, I think the other important reason for professionals in this sector to engage in research is that it exposes what I've called here the secret gardens, which exist in all organisations. And the secret gardens are where there is knowledge, data, evidence, ideas that is often kept from other people, because that's about power. That's why research is threatening. Research threatens power because it exposes the secret gardens. And the other way in which it's important, and I think, again, looking at the activity you've been engaged in, one of the really powerful aspects to a lot of these projects are that they are challenging the rhetoric of effectiveness. challenging the rhetoric of improvement, because what you're doing is showing that those kinds of weasel words that trick very easily from the mouths of people who don't work in the sector, have never worked in the sector, wouldn't stand last 5 minutes in the sector, they're nice treacly words that slip off the tongue. And the more we can do this research to say we don't want those slippery words, what we want is to have more holistic and transformative solutions, and those are not easy. So that's a picture of the Trojan horse, the famous Trojan horse, which some of you can see in the front, and it's being brought into, so all the soldiers can jump out and wage war and so on. And I've put at the top of the slide, for those of you who can't see, evidence for myth busting and telling truth to power. So one of the questions for you is, okay, so you've done this research, do you see yourself as a Trojan horse now within your organisation or within the wider sector more generally? So in other words, do you see yourself as, in a military sense, you're going to break down the barricades and cause mayhem? Because there are problems with the Trojan horse analogy, and of course the Trojan horse was full of a lot of people. You may be struggling away on your own, and that's very hard. It's very hard to change the world on your own. So Norman again referred to the notion of communities of practice, and there's very interesting conceptual and theoretical development has been going on to kind of push the concept of communities of practice. So I introduce you to this term epistemic cultures, communities and practices. And what that means is knowledge-based. So what epistemic communities do is they have a shared set of principles, and they derive their ideas and solve problems by analysing practices through a conceptual lens. So again, that's where theory and concepts come in, and again make it different to reflective practice. Epistemic communities produce and use usable knowledge. In other words, knowledge that's created out of practice gets transformed through checking that against theory and ideas and brings new knowledge to the table. So what I think we need to do is to start to think about, and I've used the word teachers here, but if you're not a teacher, if you see yourself as a trainer or something else, just change that word. What I think we need in the further education sector is professionals to be knowledge producers. Because the expertise, huge expertise, rests within your daily practice. And the more you can research and expose that, I think what I would hope we might start to encourage, and it's already happening in your organisations just by dint of what you've been doing, is that we start to turn education and training organisations into repositories of evidence and ideas. Not places that continually look for ideas from outside, but are repositories themselves of evidence and ideas. And that's powerful knowledge. And that's the way to start to challenge power, rhetoric, and nonsense. Thank you very much.